I've been asked by Chisimani Center for Activist Education to facilitate this session today. And maybe the people from Chisimani at some point will say what Chisimani is all about and what it does. But we are here today for two lectures. And the lecture that will start now is a lecture on the world order and the present of and the place of the global south within that world order. And then that will take us from 10:30 and including the discussions about 12:30. We'll have then a lunch, and then we'll have an afternoon lecture which would be about how do we understand the present economic crisis. And the people who will lead the discussion through short inputs are two comrades from Canada. It's Sam Gindel and Leo Panitch. Historically, they've been linked to York University in Canada, but they've been here before South Africa. We call them the Friends of NUMSA. They've been in South Africa when there were debates on economic policy before 1994. They've also visited the Union, and they've arrived in South Africa now on the 10th, and they've spent some time in Johannesburg giving lectures at the university, activists, and with the shop stewards on Wednesday and Thursday. They are here in Cape Town, and they're starting their lecture series here. And what's going to happen is that Leo will start to talk about how do we understand the present world order and the place of the South within it. And Sam will make some addition, and we're hoping to have a more than an hour's of discussion and coming back, and then Sam will then start in the afternoon with how we understand the present economic crisis. So, with that, I'll give over to Leo.
Thank you so much, Dinga. It's a pleasure to be here, not least because I get the sense that the left in Cape Town aren't quite as much Stakhanovites as the left in Joburg. They've worked us over the last 10 days with a degree of exploitation that I don't think I've ever experienced before. If you guys have got a productivity problem in South Africa, it surprises me, I have to say. Rather than starting at 10:30, from the moment we arrived, we started at 9 every day at WITS under Vishwas Sitgar's direction. The 4-hour seminar till 1, 3 successive days, then a public lecture, then an all-day conference on decolonizing international relations, whatever the hell that means. And then finally 2 full days with NUMSA, although that was bracketed the first day we arrived with a full day with Erwin Jim, who is himself quite a strict Stakhanovite, I have to say. So it's a pleasure to be here, really. It's and of course, one's heard a lot about the Cape Town left. I haven't been here since '95 when Dodd Keat hosted me. And it'll really be very interesting to get feedback from you. Dinga gave us the title of The World Order Today in the Global South for this morning, and the capitalist crisis for this afternoon. And obviously they'll overlap, but we'll try to address more the global South in world capitalism today and the world empire today. Until really last year, it was very, very common on the left to think that there was a fundamental challenge emanating from the quote-unquote global south that needs unpacking, obviously, to the American-led global imperial capitalist order. Not only had there been a clear shift in co-management, at least visible co-management of global capitalism from the G7 to the G20, there had emerged the so-called BRICS. This had originally been a term coined by a Goldman Sachs investment broker who was telling hedge funds that the smart place to invest as of 2000, 2001 were Brazil, Russia, India, China. But then those countries took that acronym on themselves. And just after the G20 meeting in Washington, where the G20 countries, at the height of the crisis, pledged themselves to keeping the global capitalist open, free trade, free enterprise order going even amidst the crisis. And they retained that commitment at each successive G20 meeting. Immediately after that, the leaders of Brazil, Russia, India, and China met in Yekaterinburg in Russia. And then 2 years later, South Africa was added to a meeting of these leaders, and that's how it became the BRICS. They were already at that time beginning to not only collectively promote a shift in the IMF voting rules, so they would have a larger say in the IMF, but also to raise the idea of a BRICS bank. That is equivalent to the Bank of the South that had been imagined and never taken off in South America. Centered around China's predominance in the world of the global South, but going beyond that. And this bank was launched, at least its launching was announced, in Fortaleza, Brazil in July 2014, less than 2 years ago. When it was launched in that July, Joe Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winning former chief economist of the World Bank, said that it signaled a clear challenge to the US-led world order, reflecting, and I'm quoting him, a fundamental change in global economic and political power. More impressively and persuasively, perhaps, Fidel Castro associated it with his own country's resistance to the most powerful empire ever to exist. And he expressed his confidence that the BRICS leaders' promotion of, quote, cooperation and solidarity with the peoples in the achievement of sustainable development and the eradication of poverty would culminate in, again I'm quoting, one of the greatest feats in human history. This is Castro 2 years ago. How does this look today? I mean, obviously a more sober assessment even then was needed than that. But how does this look today? First of all, I think we need to step back and get a proper assessment of what's been going on during the course of the making of a global capitalism over the last not just 3.5 decades, but really since World War II. What's been happening with the quote-unquote third world, underdeveloped world as it was called, what's now called the Global South, with it covers such an array of different social formations that one wonders whether it's a proper label for the world outside of the advanced capitalist countries. In our book, The Making of Global Capitalism, we actually call this the rest of the world, outside of the G7, Northern European and North American and Japanese capitalist economies. When the former empires of Europe and Japan which had established exclusive spheres of influence through the creation, conquering, incorporation of colonies from the last 2 decades of the 19th century to World War I. When those former empires, which had clearly engaged in inter-imperial rivalry and which had produced World War I and even arguably World War II, when they were defeated and were integrated, even if they were part of the victory, the Allies' victory, were integrated into the informal American empire after 1945, the term imperialism shifted from referring to inter-imperial rivalry amongst the leading capitalist countries to a notion of imperialism as reflecting a imperial capitalist core vis-a-vis a underdeveloped, dependent periphery. This is the famous kind of world systems theory, dependency theory model, and imperialism was largely transferred as a concept that way. It had begun as a notion, and Marxism had made much of its running in the 20th century on the notion of it being a war to the death amongst the capitalist trusts that had captured each of the leading capitalist power states, right, to rather a capitalist condominium to the exclusion of, and indeed to the exploitation of, the rest of the world, leaving aside, bracketing, of course, that part of the world that had placed itself outside of the sphere of capital accumulation. First the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union's empire in Eastern Europe, whatever the hell type of empire that was, but it wasn't a capitalist one. And then after the Chinese Revolution, the even larger portion of humanity accounted for by China. And following the kind of rhetoric that one heard at Bandung in the mid-1950s, although if you go back and look at it, plenty of that was anti-communist, if you actually look at the communiques coming out of Bandung. But following that, it was very common to see imperialism shifted as a concept, as an understanding, to this exploitation by the core of the periphery. If you were on the left, there's no doubt that you saw the peasantry and working classes as the periphery, as the potential revolutionary agents in light of that against imperialism. But it was often vague, and it often overlapped with some notion of import substitution industrialization, whereby working classes would link up with a newly ambitious industrial bourgeoisies in the global south that would challenge the empire to the north. It was certainly the case that whereas imperialism of the old variety involved the deepest linkages at the level of economics and the state running from the empires to their colonies and through their colonies, now the deepest linkages existed amongst the former empires orchestrated by the United States. The deepest linkages in terms of foreign direct investment no longer went primarily to the south. It went amongst the advanced capitalist countries. The deepest linkages in security and intelligence, in state apparatuses more generally, in military terms, and so on. Now, this was to some extent reflected, of course, in the economic nationalism that accompanied the liberation struggle victories on this continent and beyond, and was given a further push by the Cuban Revolution, etc. And that economic nationalism The real economic effects that independent, autonomous, even if peripheral states could have on the world was seen in the fact that commodity prices rising in the 1960s, along with wages rising in the global north, were two of the key factors in producing the economic crisis of the 70s, the profit squeeze of the 1970s. And it kind of reached its peak when the United Nations in 1974, the General Assembly, passed a charter of economic rights and freedoms, which explicitly endorsed not only nationalization, but expropriation of foreign capital. Times Magazine had a full-page cover after that, in the middle, of course, of the economic crisis at home, which had 3 words on it: can capitalism survive? In 1974, there were no less than 87 expropriations in what is now called the Global South. Some of those without compensation, most of them with, but nevertheless, this scared them. That said, on Wall Street, as we discovered when researching our book, there was a memo sent from a Treasury official who had been talking to the heads of the big investment banks in 1974-75. And he said, the bankers are discounting the rhetoric. Bankers always discount assets. They figure out, that bonds are likely to, they're discounting South African bonds right now, right? They're selling them off at what they expect will be their future value. Well, in this case, they were discounting the rhetoric because many of these states were borrowing extremely heavily from them. These banks were sitting awash in recycled petrodollars and were lending them not only to Latin American dictators, they were lending them to Eastern European communist states. They even started lending them by the early 80s to China, those funds. That discounting of the rhetoric certainly needed to be done. There were, of course, vast external pressures through the course of the 1980s, through the turn to neoliberalism in the 1980s, through the debt crisis that all states in the Global South suffered during the 1980s, when the Americans resolved the crisis of the 1970s by raising interest rates to 18%, broke the backs of their trade unions, induced a deliberate deep recession. And those 18% interest rates had a profound effect on the Global South. And as far as the American Federal Reserve and Treasury were concerned, which really, the Federal Reserve is the world's central bank, established the value of the dollar as good as gold with that move in 1981, after a decade of instability, after the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates broke down. What happened to the Global South was an afterthought as far as the Federal Reserve was concerned. They were establishing the value of the dollar as the international reserve currency. Didn't think through what this would mean even to Mexico on their border. But of course, as soon as interest rates were raised that high to states in the Global South that had borrowed so heavily through the 1970s, even if that was partly to keep an import industrialization strategy going, this made it impossible for them to go back to the bond markets and roll over their debts. There was a vast outflow of capital, and in that context, you got the IMF structural adjustment programs, first imposed upon Turkey, and then across the Global South, and even here under the apartheid regime. You saw the first instances of that. The Americans had been pushing since President Kennedy, the trade round of 1983, although they had supported import substitution industrialization, they didn't mind industrial development so long as American multinational, indeed any other multinational corporations could be part of it. In the 1950s, they had supported it. But with the crisis of the dollar, by 1963, they were no longer providing direct food aid to the global south. They were providing loans. And the thing about loans is they have to be repaid. And if they have to be repaid, then you have to have exports. And if you have to have exports, then your economic strategy is indeed export-oriented rather than internal development. That had already been going on, and it produced certain successes, above all in East Asia, most famously with South Korea. That partly involved getting on the backs of the Japanese with their very successful export strategy to the United States, aided by a deliberate favorable exchange rate to the Japanese in light of the Chinese Revolution. But South Korea replicated that. So much so that already by 1980, South Korea's exports, manufacturing exports, were, I think manufacturing was, what, Sam, 80%? 80. By 1979.
It had been 7%
in the early 60s.
Yeah.
In the early 60s, it had gone from 7% manufacturing exports of its total exports to 80% of its total exports. I mean, this broke with the whole image of what the third world was. Right? It was an exporter of resources, if you could even call it an exporter. And, you could even say it was simply a matter of them being exploited of their resources. Malaysia started following this. So did Thailand, already in the 1970s. The Chinese communist elite, with the collapse of Maoism and the quote-unquote Gang of Four, you'll remember that, by 1979, 1980, we're visiting Japan and watching the South Korean model very, very closely. The roots of what eventually happens to China go back to that. You didn't see so much of a shift until the 80s in other parts of the global south, but you did see it with the imposition of structural adjustment programs, which oriented those states much more fully to export orientation, to opening up themselves to foreign direct investment even more than they had been, to signing bilateral investment and trade treaties with the United States and other capitalist countries that guaranteed the inviolability of foreign assets, that guaranteed that foreign corporations would be treated just as domestic corporations. But above all, and people tend to forget this, there was also a shift on the part of their ruling classes. They started sending their children to the Harvard Business School. From Latin America, etc. They were no longer trying to exclude foreign capital from third world development. They were trying to get on the backs of foreign capital for third world development. And that was taking place even through trying to get their families involved in it, something that's very familiar, of course, here as well as in China. That decade was brutal. As the defeat of the working classes in the North was very significant, the brutality of the structural adjustment turn to neoliberalism in the global South was far, far more brutal. But it was successful. We have to see that in capitalist terms it was successful. By the end of the 90s, Turkey and India 80% of their exports were manufacturing exports. 60% of Brazil's were manufacturing exports. A vast proletariat was being created in these countries, however large the peasantry remained in a country like India. However significant the landless peoples movement was in Brazil. A proletariat of a much larger kind that always existed, of course, as an enclave, a powerful one in the countries of the global south in some cases. But now a massive proletarianization was going on. In China's case, even before it entered the WTO or was admitted to the WTO in 2000, 90% of its exports were manufacturing exports. And the type of manufacturing this was one that integrated them very closely into the American-led global capitalist order. That is, they were often suppliers to MNCs that had invested in their countries, or they were suppliers to mass retailers in the global north. And you got, which was already predicted with the new international division of labor people in the 1970s, you got integrated global production of a very significant kind. So not only were these countries dependent now on exporting to the United States, to a lesser extent Europe, they were in fact integrated in their production with the MNCs and their supply chains, their value chains, in every case. This was combined because of the removal of capital controls and exchange controls by the early 90s. This was combined with very, very deep financial integration, whereby it was no longer loans from the advanced capitalist countries that covered the deficits of the countries of the quote-unquote global south. They were going to the investment banks directly. And hedge funds, investment banks, workers' insurance funds, pension funds were buying third world assets. That deep financial integration produced 72 financial crises in the global south in the 1990s. But except in one case, that of Malaysia, which reimposed capital controls but only for 1 year, this led to new structural adjustment programs, of the kind that's going on here now, when the rating agencies come and tell you what need to do in order to get back into international bond markets. The IMF, but above all, the American Treasury would come. Even to South Korea, as it finally did in 1997, after the Asian crisis broke out in Thailand. And tell them what they needed to do to get back into international financial markets, to stop the run on their currency. And every one of them stepped back from capital controls, fearing what, as the ANC, SACP, Kasatu government did, fearing what being excluded from global capital markets would mean. Having had the taste of this massive flow of foreign direct investment into the global south, especially in the first half of the 1990s. This obviously, with manufacturing, with the global integrated production leading to manufacturing in a number of very, very significant countries of the global south, even if there, of course, were enormous regions that didn't fit this bill, not least of Africa. Right? This led to some of the leading proponents of the understanding of imperialism in terms of core periphery, in terms of the people who had thought that a revolution against capitalism would not come from the advanced capitalist working classes anymore, but would come from the global south. This led some of the leading proponents of this, most famously our friend, late and lamented Giovanni Arrighi, to say, well, you know, we didn't see a return to inter-imperial rivalry from the north. He had predicted Japan would be the rival to the United States, and then with the collapse the Japanese challenge by the late 80s, early 90s, he shifted to China and saw China as standing at the core of a new challenge to American-led global capitalism. And as the developments that led to the BRICS could be seen developing a material foundation, as Brazil started shifting its agriculture to soy production, so that 60% of Brazilian agriculture was now soy and was being exported to China to feed the new proletariat. As Argentina was doing the same. As this country, which is why it's considered part of the BRICS, started seeing its trade relations, its investment relations as deepening much more with China than with the countries of the global north. That's not to say it shifted it entirely, but in terms of the growth rates of investment and of trade, right, that's where it was taking place. This wasn't true nearly as much of Russia and India, but you know, Russia and India, if you like, ideologically stood apart from the American empire. Retains, Russia did some of, as India had done, some of the third worldist rhetoric. And as you saw manufacturing develop in India, usually they were attached to this as well. Although the linkages between Russia, India, and China were not nearly as deeply as would develop with Brazil and South Africa. So this was the foundation of this notion, which the BRICS themselves started presenting by 2008 as not only being able to de-link from an American-led global world order, but to challenge it. And as you saw, a lot of the left, including the soft left from Joe Stiglitz, if you like, to the truly revolutionary left like Fidel Castro, bought into this. What are we to make of this? Well, Sam will speak to this, I think, more deeply, but it was extremely superficial in terms of not recognizing the very, very deep integration of China above all in this new global capitalism. This was the late developing capitalist country that had had the most foreign direct investment in history. This was the late developing capitalist country which was most dependent on exports to the empire. This was the late developing capitalist country which had the largest amount of American Treasury bills in its portfolio. And although people spoke of that as the Chinese doing the Americans a favor, they weren't doing the Americans a favor. They were doing this because they had such a tremendous export surplus with the United States they feared nothing more than a revaluation of the exchange rate, which would undermine their whole exchange strategy. They were prisoners to keeping the American dollar where it was. Right? Were they to have pulled out of American Treasury bills, the result of that would have been tremendously disadvantaged their export capacity. Right? So they were trapped. And not only that, they were happy to be trapped. It'll be interesting to have a conversation about this, but in our view, the Chinese communist elite had turned itself, as Trotsky had predicted might happen in '79 in the case of the Soviet Union. Why he didn't want to call it state capitalist, so he didn't think that had happened yet. But the Chinese communist elite has turned itself very venally into a bourgeoisie in ways that should be recognizable to people in South Africa 20 years after apartheid. It isn't to say they necessarily own the assets themselves, but their children, their families do. Or their children's and their families make an enormous amount of wealth with special contracts to state-owned enterprises. Therefore there was a great deal of emulation of the capitalist empire rather than an attempt to challenge it. That isn't to say that there weren't and aren't contradictions in the relationship between these new large capitalist powers and what is still very much an American-led global capitalist order. Obviously, it's much more difficult to integrate China, India, Brazil, Russia, than it was to integrate the states of Northern Europe, given common religions, a high degree of migration of a friendly kind, given the long history of ruling class ties, etc. It's a much more difficult process culturally to integrate these newly developing states of the global South. Moreover, the policeman role that the American state plays in the world, which Sam and I do not think can be understood as them trying to merely protect American multinationals or to get benefits for American multinationals. It's a policeman role that goes along with the responsibility the American state has had to take on since 1945. It's almost a burden to being the state of global capitalism. I mean, the world's capitalist classes have since 1945 looked to the United States as its ultimate protector. Whether they're faced with revolutionary classes at home, or whether as a place to put their money when you need to run. Right? In this country, Toronto, where we come from, was known as to run to in the 1980s. Right? That's because it was so easy to get one's money from Toronto to Wall Street, or to feel comfortable sitting in Toronto, being next to the empire, given we are the most integrated state in the American empire, of course, in the world. Right? A rich dependency, if you like. But that role that the American state has played has been genuinely a policeman for global capitalism as a whole. It has not been exclusive to protecting American capital's assets, to opening space for American investment. Not at all. As Sam often points out, if you look at what happened after the '98 Asian crisis, it was German capital, it was French capital, it was British capital, much more than American, that went pouring in. Not to say American multinationals didn't benefit, etc. Right? And their policeman role is much more, we usually use the example, it's much more like the role of policeman that you know given the disorder in a society like this. Right? They're trying to keep law and order. in a chaotic, irrational, exploitative, increasingly unequal capitalism. You see that at the national level. You see it with the LA Police Department or the police department in Ferguson, Missouri, right? And you see it at a global level with the role the American state plays in trying to simply keep order in this world. Now, of course, it doesn't want someone who they see like a hoodlum like Saddam Hussein that they can't control, right? Having a lot of power in his region, just like they don't want to see a black drug gang leader, right? With a lot of power in South Central LA, someone they can't control, right? But this is not a matter of the old reductive kind of notion of imperialism, whereby every time they intervene, it's because they're doing something for an American corporation. That's not the case. And that's one of the contradictions. That's one of the contradictions. That they act as policemen and it blows up in their face, and just as it often does in American cities, right? Because they can't really control this, right? So that's another contradiction. A further contradiction is that when they impose sanctions, in order not to send troops in immediately, as in Iran or in Russia in the case of the conflict over the Ukraine, this produces contradictions with the role of the Federal Reserve and New York as the financial center of the world. That's why, it's so piddly against Russia. These bans they put on the oligarchs' investments in Western banks. I mean, it's a tiny little thing, and it's because they're afraid this would have the effect of throwing a poker into the international financial system. Some of that did happen with Iranian sanctions, whereby Japanese banks got caught facilitating trade with Iran, and then got fined by other American. The Treasury allowed them to do this, look the other way while they did it. But then other agencies in New York State started fining the Japanese banks heavily for these sanctions, and the American state was fighting against itself in a confusing way over trying to keep these sanctions going vis-a-vis Iran. So these are contradictions that are real. Moreover, you see with the Trump candidacy now, and not only the Trump candidacy, that there is a resentment in the United States against its imperial role as the manager of global capitalism. It's been around for a long time. Every time there was a bailout of a country of the global south by the American Treasury, the great peso crisis in Mexico in '94, etc., there were rumblings in Congress, opposition in Congress, including from the Democrats, not only the Republicans. What are you doing lending money to foreigners? Right? With a good element of racist prejudice there, always. But in any case, they even don't like it when they lend it to the Europeans. You could see in that sense a contradiction inside the American state. And it's blowing up now in a very big way, politically, in this presidential campaign. It overlays, obviously, with the fact, we'll deal with this when Sam talks about the crisis this afternoon, with the fact that neoliberalism has involved the restructuring of the American economy in the wake of the defeat of trade unionism in the early 80s, so that American wages have stagnated, manufacturing has declined, and so on. And there is a new right which is appealing to the working class the way that Hitler appealed to the German working class, with a nationalism, a right-wing nationalism, that would ostensibly pull out America's economic role in managing the world, while increasing its military and police role in the world. Right? We'll bomb the hell out of them, Trump keeps on saying, right? I'll end with this. The irony is that there's been an alignment in the United States, which Hillary Clinton now represents because of the Trump phenomenon, between the human rights imperialists those who after Rwanda supported, encouraged, pressured the American state to intervene on human rights grounds. Only the United States can save the poor and exploited of the world, right? Inevitably, that has imperial overtones whenever the United States intervenes, whatever the intentions of these good-minded liberals. And then the hard-nosed neoconservatives who want the Americans and want the president to have a free hand in being policemen of the world. I think they are coming together around the Clinton candidacy. So be careful what you wish for. But this is taking place in a world where the challenge from the global south, we can see it was ludicrous to see the BRICS as challenging an American-led global capitalist order. And Sam and I were engaged in debates with Origi over 10 years ago on this. It's obvious. China has no ambition to displace the United States and take on the burden of managing a global capitalism. It doesn't have the capacity, even if it did have. Right? It doesn't have the deep capital markets. It doesn't have the institutional state capacity to do this. Right? There's plenty of tensions, right? Of a military kind, but in the South China Sea, those are regional. Right? But the Chinese are signing on constantly to opening up, if they can, their financial markets, their exchange controls, etc. This then immediately produces contradictions for them as capital flows out. It's flowing out at an enormous pace as Chinese growth rates fall. And we'll talk about this afternoon. The global crisis, which is still continuing, the economic crisis, is shifting from where it began in the core, the United States, shifted to Europe, and now it's shifting to the global south, to the BRICS, with the collapse of commodity prices. And those commodity prices are collapsing because China's growth is collapsing. Right? And you feel this very deeply here in South Africa, they feel it very deeply in Brazil. But what is also visible and important is that in terms of internal class, which really matters, developments in these countries, there's no basis for a challenge. There are hundreds of thousands of strikes called protests in China every year. But they are disorganized, they're not connected with one another, and they aren't about to displace the Chinese Communist Party for some considerable period. That would be a very different challenge in any case. Involve a whole reorientation of China's economic development strategy. Tragically, in Brazil and the rest of Latin America, you see a defeat of the pink tide, whether it was the more radical Venezuelan or Bolivian model, or whether it was the social democratic, softer Lula Dilma model. So the contradictions of managing the empire grow, but the challenge from the global south, I mean, I haven't even talked about, a quasi-fascist-led India and an increasingly fascist-led Russia. There's nothing progressive about any of this. The left has nothing to get excited about with the BRICS, and in any case, their ability to challenge this order, let alone their willingness to, is by no means very clear. Sam, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think is anxious to get to the questions, so I'll defer and maybe I'll make some comments.